Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Is your host, Nick Giordano. I am glad you could join me today. Make sure that you are a follower and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and make sure that you share this episode with your family and friends. We are now coming up on the 23rd anniversary of 9/11, and it really is amazing. 23 years have gone by, and it seems like a lot of Americans have forgotten about that day and what it's cost us ever since that day. But it also seems like an entire generation is ignorant of what happened that day and how America and the world profoundly changed. But I have a great guest coming on. He's been on before. We routinely do 9/11 episodes. I have Steve Kuhr. He's the president of the Kuhr Group. He is also the host of 5 Minutes to Chaos. Everyone needs to check out that podcast. I'll have the links up at the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. Former Deputy Commissioner, New York City, Office of Emergency Management, and the former Director of Office of Emergency Management at state level. Steve, welcome to the program. How are you?
Nick, good to see you. Always good to see you.
And well, it's always a pleasure for you to join me. And everyone needs to know, in full disclosure, Steve was like my mentor. So if you have any complaints about me, bring it to Steve. He's the one that, trained me, and he's part of the problem, I guess. But Steve, I mean, we're at 23 years since 9/11, and I want to get to the emergency management aspect in a little bit and the build out of that following 9/11. But what are your thoughts? I mean, you were the New York City deputy commissioner then. You lost your brother-in-law who died of 9 related illnesses. You lost countless friends and people that you worked at in the EMS community, law enforcement, fire. What are your thoughts today, 23 years later?
Well, I have a hard time getting my arms around the fact that it is 23 years. And the real struggle, the immediate impact was catastrophic. 343 members of the New York City Fire Department, including firefighters, EMS personnel, fire inspection personnel, something to the tune of 20 independent EMS providers, dozens of police officers from the NYPD and the Port Authority Police. But in the 23 years after, and to this moment, we're still losing members of public safety agencies, construction agencies that did demolition, even citizens that were down there to 9/11 related illnesses. Thank you for mentioning my brother-in-law. My sister's husband was New York City Fire Department Rescue Paramedic and Special Operations Command, and he was called to the scene, and he contracted and died in 2017 from head and neck cancer. So the effects of 9/11 are catastrophic and are ongoing.
Yeah, and I want to tell the audience, I believe the number is now over 5,500 people have died, plus people have died from 9/11 related injuries. That's on top of the 3,000, nearly 3,000 that we lost that day. And so this was catastrophic, and it still impacts us. And it's why we continue to talk about it. I mean, when we look at the loss of life and then the start of the war on terrorism, it's really hard to grapple everything that's happened since. Now, following 9/11, we recognized the need to build out emergency management and homeland security. So just for the audience out there, they're not emergency management specialists. Can you just give them a basic understanding of what is emergency management?
I'm glad you asked that, because we've done episodes on 9/11, as you mentioned earlier before, and it strikes me as odd that the general public really doesn't know what emergency management is. And if you think about it, we don't really market ourselves very well. And in the public sector, at least, emergency management is in the shadows behind their elected leaders. To some extent, that's okay. But it's important for your listeners to understand that emergency management exists in the United States at almost every governmental level, starting at the federal level with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. every state and territory in the United States has a state or territorial level emergency management agency. And then as you go down through the counties, tribal nations, local jurisdictions to including cities, towns, and villages, to some extent have some form of an emergency management operation. The larger of those would be the big cities, big city emergency management agencies like New York City. I was fortunate to be a founding member of the New York City Office of Emergency Management, which was created by the mayor in 1996. And as you mentioned, you and I worked at state level emergency management in New York as well. On the private sector, similar operations exist. So let's assume some of your listeners are in the corporate sector, CEOs, COOs, managers, and businesses. They might have an emergency management operation, don't even realize it. It might be called risk management. It might be called business continuity. It might be called crisis management. But what is done in both the private and public sector are very, very similar.
Yeah,
And
as it should be.
Right. And we're talking about preparing, understanding risk, understanding the intelligence that could impact a community or an organization, and preparing through planning processes to respond, exercises, and the ability to bring the necessary agencies or assets to bear to respond appropriately to an organization to reduce the impact on a community or save an organization, to make the organization resilient and essentially to be able to survive a disaster.
We saw the build out of emergency management following 9/11, and we continued to see it, right? When we look at man-made and natural disasters, we saw the growth following 9/11. We saw the growth following Hurricane Katrina, because we've seen the threats that we face, whether it's a man-made or natural disaster. It seems that over the last several years, a lot of people have forgotten about emergency management, and I want to talk to you about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Steve, over the last several years, it seems that a lot of people have forgotten the importance of emergency management, what we do, and why it's critical. It's crucial because it saves lives. And I really saw this a lot when it came to the coronavirus. You had a lot of people making decisions that were never trained in emergency management and the principles of emergency management. You saw the public health officials basically run everything without any type of input from any other sector, which is always crucial in emergency management. Do you think that the further we've moved out from 9/11, do you think we have taken a step backwards over the last several years?
Well, I think the coronavirus pandemic was part of the problem or the beginning of the problem. I had every reason to believe that emergency management agencies would lead the crisis as they do every other crisis at a strategic level. I'm not talking about something more localized like a structure fire or a hostage situation, which would clearly be run by fire department or law enforcement agency incident commanders. I'm talking about a community strategic impact, like a corona, an epidemic, let's say, or a flood disaster, which would have multiple locations of impact. It's yet unclear to me why emergency management agencies ended up being put into the shadows by their elected leaders. I think on it, just to do a quick assessment of that, I think they just elected leaders assumed that public health agencies, public health agencies were equipped to lead these crises. They would be, but not to lead the whole thing. Emergency managers have their finger on the pulse of all the agencies. Emergency management is a systems of systems approach. Emergency managers have the opportunity, because they work daily with all the agencies that have the capabilities such as transportation, health, law enforcement, fire rescue, finance, education, homeless and housing services, health and human services, to bring all these agencies to bear. Public health agencies would be more narrow focused. And while there are emergency management operations within some public health agencies, their focus is not the broader community. It was a mistake for emergency management agencies not to be put in charge, or maybe that's not the right word, or to have more of a facilitation and coordination responsibility during the pandemic. And I think that has had some bleed over effect until today, and management agencies are once again finding their footing. It's not the first time this has happened. Before, you mentioned Katrina. After 9/11 and before Katrina, and with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, the emergency management industry in the United States took backseat to terrorism. In fact, FEMA was disbanded originally, if you remember the history, and there was an emergency preparedness and response directorate in the Department of Homeland Security that failed miserably on during the days of Katrina, and the post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act restored FEMA to its original state, and even enhanced its responsibility, and placed principal federal official in FEMA reporting directly to the president during catastrophic events. So emergency management sort of has this seesaw history where we go up and down. I think we're on the way back up now, but it takes some people that have had their finger on the pulse, guys like Jerry Hauer. Let me mention Jerry. You and I worked for Jerry Hauer. Fortunately, he passed away about a year ago. But Jerry Hauer was godfather of emergency management, or at least urban emergency management. And he developed or led the development of a program that was a very lean-in, crisis management-oriented emergency management program. We need to restore that mental mindset about how emergency management works. We need to lean into emergencies instead of just doing the planning and being put second chair to other agencies.
Absolutely. And not only doing the planning and having those plans ignored when a crisis really does come about. I mean, you and I, under your leadership, worked on strategic national stockpile plan, on a pandemic plan, bioterrorism plan. And so during the pandemic, I was like, hey, wait, what's going on? That's not what we discussed. And we worked with epidemiologists and everything. But more to the point, it seems like almost, during the coronavirus, the entire incident command structure and unified command structure just completely broke down. It was non-existent. And then, we saw the assassination attempt on the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. I'm listening to a Secret Service head, I forget his name off the top of my head, and he said that, well, maybe next time the Secret Service should send a person to the Unified Command Center. And I'm just like, whoa. Wait a minute. What did he just say? I remember in 2012 when we were at the state, we did the planning for the presidential debate over at Hofstra University. We were all on the same channel as far as communications go. Everyone was on the same page. We constantly had meetings, discussed, met with counterparts. What's going on? Is communication still really the biggest issue in emergency management where we see the failures?
Well, to answer your question direct, absolutely. And it is dismaying that 22 years after or 21 years after the 9/11 Commission report, where interagency communication was called out as one of the key failures of the day, that we find the lack of communication or straight up communication failures in the emergency management or public safety realm. And you're talking about the Secret Service. Basic emergency management was not followed there. When the Secret Service said maybe next time they'll join the unified command, in my emergency management model, everybody has a seat at the table. So if we're going to be responding to a tornado threat, or we're preparing for a hurricane, all the agencies that need to be at the table will be at the table. That was an abject failure of law enforcement in general when during the assassination attempt on the former president, because those agencies, be they law enforcement, not necessarily emergency management, although I question where was county emergency management and all that, if any. Now, clearly that's a law enforcement responsibility, but emergency management, maybe if they had a seat at the table, could have said, hey, you got that command post standing up, let's make sure Secret Service is in there. That's kind of like what we do.
Let's make sure we have all the same comms and we're on the same channel so we could actually communicate with each other on the ground.
You mentioned the incident command system, and for the listeners who are not in our business, 54 years ago, the incident command system was born in California after a series of catastrophic wildfires. And the incident command system provides emergency management, fire service, law enforcement, really anybody that needs to manage a major incident or one that has multiple independent agencies that need to come together in a unified manner with common command and control structures, common and unified communication capabilities, common and or shall we say, common goals and objectives, so everybody works off the same sheet of music. After 54 years, why do we have to keep talking about we didn't use the ICS or there was ICS failures? Of course, unified command should have been used, and unified command would have had, at the very least, the key agency heads in a single unified command post physically in the same place.
It's mind-boggling. You'd think that everyone has learned to speak from the same page, that we're all in the same boat, and we dealt with it, and it really matters. It's really important. You know, when we're in a unified command and we're in an emergency operations center, we could turn to the guy next to us, maybe from the Army Corps of Engineers, and get situational updates so that we have situational awareness. I mean, this is critical in emergency management, knowing what's going on the ground, knowing what the agencies are doing in real time to get help where it's needed, to save lives, to protect property. But Steve, we need to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to talk to you about what do you think it will take to change the mindset of the politicians, the appointed officials, the emergency managers, and the public at large. I want to talk to you about that when we get back from this quick break, so everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Steve, what do you think it will take in order to begin to change the mindset of all the officials as well as the broader public? What's the solution? And I know we're not going to solve it all in this podcast. I recognize that. But what is the solution?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, it usually takes a catastrophic event to change things, but I'm not seeing where that's really happening these days. If you look at Uvalde versus the Appalachia high school shooting just a couple of days ago, I think there were differences, but I'm not quite sure that was intentional. The law enforcement agencies in the Appalachia school seemed to be effective, responded appropriately. There was a school resource officer and a deputy on the shooter very, very quickly. But let's say that it was a lesson learned. That right in there is an opportunity for emergency management agencies to look at failures that have occurred in many places and stand up that robust capability. You know, to some extent, it's really not on the emergency managers. I am not pointing fingers at my colleague emergency managers. It's typically their political upline that don't understand emergency management, that don't show up at the exercises. Every tabletop exercise done by a government agency, there will be a seat for the chief elected officer of the jurisdiction, a mayor in a city, a governor at the state, a county commissioner at a county level. Many times they just don't show up. Emergency management is not something where elected officials, politicians, appointed officials should parachute in on the day of. They have to be part of the solution, as you say, all along. So when your emergency management agency is setting up a policy discussion, you need to be part of it because they're making policy on your behalf. Well, they're developing policy for you to approve. When an exercise happens and it's on your calendar, and I'm talking to elected officials, show up because your emergency manager is your personal crisis manager. Your emergency manager will make sure that your community or your organization becomes more survivable during an incident. But you have to be at the table. You have to understand how it works because during the coronavirus pandemic, people that had no idea how it worked were just calling the shots and making decisions and pushing emergency management into the shadows and using response tactics and strategies that were completely against the structures that we have in place, such as the incident command system, such as structures that were put in place for public health response.
Yeah, it's a shame. Politicians always ruin everything. Every single time they ruin it. And that's part of the problem because they come in at the last minute and then they start dictating, even though they're clueless about how things work. But in any event, I want to go back to 9/11 for a minute because, again, we're 23 years on. And one of the things that I find highly disturbing is I don't even call them protests anymore. These are pro-Hamas movements that we're seeing take place, particularly on college campuses throughout the country. We're hearing chants of death to America, death to Israel, basically death to Western civilization. But more importantly, there was a poll that 30% of Gen Zers believe that Osama bin Laden had the right ideas, believe that he was right and is sympathetic to his viewpoint. What are your thoughts as someone that lived through 9/11 and was so close to it?
Well, I struggle with that. Um, when my colleagues are still dying from 9/11 related illnesses, that we have American, and they're not just kids. You see some of these protests where there are older people, perhaps professors or just people from the community that are both pro-Hamas and anti-American. And quite frankly, I'm repulsed by that as a patriot and as somebody that has dedicated his life to the protection of American citizenry, whether it was my time in the fire department as a paramedic or as a chief officer or in emergency management, helping communities and states and organizations, because I've been an emergency manager in the organization sector as well, prepare to see these types of protests go on is just it's really hard. It's really heartbreaking, and I can only blame in part because protests have existed throughout our history. To some extent, it's who we are. But these protests are ill-informed and malicious. A simple understanding of the difference between an Israeli and American Jew would probably help alleviate some anti-Semitism. Just because you're an American Jew does not mean that you support Israeli politics and policies. I mean, that's just how it is. Not all Jews are Israelis, and it's just important for these people to try to make some effort to understand what the difference is. Of course, I'm not suggesting that any form of sympathy towards these terrorist groups is appropriate, but I have to blame in today's world extremist politicians, extremist mass media, and social media, or I should say biased mass media, because the world of the journalist, as we understand it from when we were younger, is kind of lost. And today, it's really a ching-ching scenario where it's better to draw a conclusion for you instead of giving you the information to make your own decision. And I'm blaming both sides. I'm blaming the left and the right for having, biased media, and that leads to the ability for the media to influence people, especially as those that are unable to make their own decisions, and it leads to groupthink on a mass level, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, especially on the four-year university campuses.
Well, look at some of the interviews, and I think some of these are probably cherry-picked also, but do you know what from the river to the sea means? And these people, then again, I was going to say kids, they don't have a clue. They don't know what river and what sea, or they don't understand the tunnel system. I saw that recently, an interview that somebody did with some people at one of the protests. They don't understand the tunnel system, or that so much money that has gone to Gaza has been appropriated by terrorist groups and put to work in nefarious ways. And it's just this groupthink that's going on. And it's almost like it's vogue to be anti-American. I say pack your stuff and leave if you don't like this country, and go to a country where you'll see what it's like to live under some of these regimes. And I'm not talking about another Western country like those in Western Europe. If you hate this
So you're
country
saying
so
Italy
much,
is off the table?
well, Italy is, they got the best food, so probably not. But
Well, no, that's true. I always say, in order to get a high school diploma at this point, we should send you to one of the worst countries in the world for like a 3-week period. We'll make sure you stay safe, but you should see how the real world operates. And I think that that's what it is. I mean, we have this ignorance throughout American society. We see this anti-Americanism being fed to them. And it's when you have an education system that has completely failed to educate students on the United States, on the philosophies of liberty and freedom, and on the great things at the United States. I say teach the totality of American history, both the good and the bad. But we have to recognize what an exceptional nation we are. I think the failure to teach that and instead fill them that we're just simply a racist, oppressive, hateful country has led us to this moment where you have some celebrating the October 7th attacks, you have some celebrating 9/11 23 years later, and then you have normal people like you and myself that are horrified by what we're seeing. Can any country survive when people in that country despise it?
Well, where did it change? You know, when I was in grade school, we stood up every morning and did the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm a member of a retired law enforcement, fire rescue, and EMS group in the community I live, and every meeting begins with the Pledge of Allegiance, and nobody has any issue. Everybody stands and puts their hand on their heart and says that. But we learned history. So when I was in grade school, we learned about Pearl Harbor. We learned about the Revolutionary War, all the way, American history all the way up through. So that would have been the 60s. Probably not civil rights, but probably probably World War II. See, where did that
You're
change?
dating yourself.
I am dating myself. I mean, I mean, I'm an old guy, but I also have you know, the the scars to go along with that. So I could talk a little bit about that.
Well,
Where
that's the
did, where
amazing
did,
part. When I went to school, I wasn't the greatest student, but I learned about America. I learned about the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. I learned about slavery and the Trail of Tears and Japanese internment camps. We learned both the good and the bad of civics and American history. And we got a good grasp of the Constitution. Unfortunately, it seems in this day and age, they're not teaching it at all. And I could verify that because I teach the students that are coming out of high school
so,
and they don't know much about the country at all.
so I've taught in classroom as well, and at the graduate and undergraduate level. And I recall a scenario where I was teaching a course on Homeland Security and emergency management planning. And we were talking about authorities that empower emergency management. And these were, the students were in their 20s. They didn't understand the basics of U.S. government, and I ended up teaching at its most elemental level what the structure of the U.S. government was, basic civics. Well, I should say the federalist structure. So we spoke about you know the three uh, divisions of government, and then I had to tell them that there was an upper house and a lower house in Congress,
That's
and then
scary.
we had to talk right, and we had to talk about you know the government at the state level and the county level and where the power really lies. The power is not supposed to lie at the federal level, as you and I both know, and it's a struggle. Well, not a big deal to do it. I mean, I had to do it, but the point I'm making your point. These young individuals showed up to my class and were unprepared as Americans to talk about their own government, their
Yeah.
own society.
And it really is shameful, especially when you look at a day like 9/11, where 23 years ago, so many have lost their lives. And we can't just say, fire, EMS, police, innocent civilians. We also have to look at the tens of thousands of troops that came back with life-altering injuries from the war. We have to look at the, 9,000 troops or nearly 9,000 troops that came back in flag-draped coffins. And that's why every American should really learn to appreciate the country that they come from. I mean, the reality is that, as Reagan said, this is the last great hope. If the United States doesn't work, it's going to be some dark times. Steve, I always enjoyed the discussion with you, particularly on 9/11, to remember and honor all those that have fallen for this country, that have sacrificed so much for this country. And obviously, thank you for your service.
And thank you for yours. It's always a great pleasure to be on the show with you, but it was also back in the day a great pleasure to work at your side in our emergency management roles.
And we had fun. We certainly had fun.
We did.
And everyone, go to the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. From there, I'll have links up to 5 Minutes to Chaos and the Kuhr Group, and to follow Steve on all the social media platforms. Steve, thanks again.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.